I think we're going to get started. For those of you who don't know me, my name is Danielle Lucier, and I'm an associate professor in the Department of Political Science. And on behalf of the Rosenfield Program in Public Affairs, International Relations, and Human Rights, it is my pleasure to introduce this afternoon's speaker, Maria Lipman, who joins us at Cornell this semester as an International Visiting Fellow. Before introducing our speaker and her topic, though, I'd like to thank the Rosenfield Program, the Institute for Global Engagement, the Russian Department, and the John Crystal Fund for making Maria's fellowship here at Cornell possible. In particular, I'd like to acknowledge the important efforts of Barb Trish, Chuchi Kapila, Todd Armstrong, Kelly Harold, Lorraine Van Wyck, and Lynn Stafford in coordinating a variety of logistics, large and small, related to Maria's overall visit to Cornell, including this public talk today. And I know we're competing with a lot of events going on campus. In fact, when we picked this date for the talk, it was quite literally the only day that we could get this auditorium at this time in the month of April. So I appreciate that those of you chose to spend your time with us today. Maria Lipman is an author, political commentator, and editor serving as an important voice in the analysis of Russian politics for more than 2 decades. At the high point of Russia's media openness in the 1990s, she served as the co-founder and deputy editor of 2 weekly Russian news magazines, Itogi, which was published in cooperation with Newsweek, and Еженедельный журнал. From 2003 to 2014, Lipman served as the editor-in-chief of the policy journal Pro et Contra, published in both English and Russian by the Carnegie Moscow Center. Lipman is a regular contributor to a variety of Russian, American, and European media publications. In particular, from 2000 to 2011, she wrote a regular op-ed column on Russian politics, media, and society for the Washington Post, and since 2012, she has written a blog for the New Yorker Online. At present, she is the editor of Point and Counterpoint, published by Ponar's Eurasia at the Institute for European, Russian, and Eurasian Studies at George Washington University. In addition to her work as a writer and editor of media, Lipman is also a regular contributor and editor of scholarship on the Russian media and civil society for academic journals and collections. Her most recent scholarly contributions include a chapter entitled The Media in the 2019 book Putin's Russia, Past Imperfect, Future Uncertain, edited by Stephen Wegman, and a chapter entitled Media in Russia, Between Modernization and Monopoly, published in 2018 in The New Autocracy, Information Politics and Policy in Putin's Russia, edited by Daniel Treisman. Today, Lipman will share with us a discussion of Russia's monument fever. The construction and dismantling of sculptured images are powerful acts of symbolic politics. As Russia continues its process of establishing its post-Soviet national identity, the Kremlin has often viewed the erection or destruction of monuments as an ideological operation. Yet it remains unclear what ideology it is pursuing. To enlighten us more on this topic, I would like to welcome Maria Lipman, who will talk to us today about commemorative statues in Russia, episodes of iconoclasm, and monument fever. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Danielle, for the introduction, and thank you, Cornell College, for the opportunity to teach here. And I would also like to thank all those named by Danielle already who made this fellowship and my invitation possible. And of course to all of you who have come to listen to me today. I will talk mostly, but not exclusively, about monuments as an element of the politics of symbols and nation building. Why monuments? I would say 2 reasons. One is that any element of nation building in today's Russia is important because we are in the process of building a new nation. Of course, after a major rupture, the collapse of the Soviet Union. Of course, monuments played an extremely important role in the Soviet nation building, and I mean, of course, Lenin statues that were ubiquitous in the Soviet Union, and still are, even though today's Russia is no longer a communist state. If the Soviet Union is no more, what does today's Russia stand for? And if we are a new nation, do we also have a new pantheon of heroes? That's one reason. Another reason is that several countries lately have gone through a period of tearing down ideologically inappropriate statues. Ukraine is one example. In recent years, Ukraine got rid of all or most all of its Lenin statues. The the process has been referred to as Leninapad, which is Lenin Fall, as in the fall of the leaves. This country, the United States, or parts of it, have also waged a campaign of monument removal, of course I mean Confederate statues. In South Africa, students at Cape Town University tore down the statue of Cecil Rhodes. It appears that British Oxford also campaigned to demolish their statue of Cecil Rhodes, but apparently British tradition prevailed over modernization, and Cecil Rhodes has survived, at least for now. In Russia, however, we've had an opposite trend in recent years, a monument fever, with more and more new symbolically charged monuments erected, many of them on the government's initiative. I will first talk about monuments in the Soviet Union, and I apologize to the Russianists in the auditorium who may be well aware of that early period. I will then turn to the commemorative practices in the early post-communist Russia, and finally get to today's Russian pantheon as it is reflected in the newly erected statues. Putin's pantheon appears to be an appropriate designation since Putin has assumed the role not just of the Russian leader, but also its nation builder, and especially in its third presidential term. Now he is in his fourth. As far as statues are concerned, over the past 100 years, Russia has lived through three spells of iconoclasm, when monuments were torn down, and two flushes of monument fever. One of them, as I mentioned, unfolding in the past few years. The term monumental propaganda is familiar to those who studied early Soviet history. As the Ancien regime was overthrown and the Bolsheviks embarked on building a new one and creating a new man, Lenin launched his plan of monumental propaganda. In spring of 1918, Lenin issued a decree that ordered to remove monuments erected in honor of the Tsars and their servants, and draft projects for monuments dedicated to the Russian Socialist Revolution. The list of appropriate figures was promptly put together. It included 62 men and 2 women, mostly European revolutionaries and revolutionary thinkers, as well as Russian academics, authors, and artists. Those historical figures were to be commemorated in stone and venerated as part of the conversion of the new nation into the one and only true creed, of course, Marxist-Leninism. And in the impatient spirit of the revolution, Lenin decreed that wrong, inappropriate monuments be torn down in 2 months' time. That was the first iconoclasm and the first frenzy of monument building. And although the deadline of 2 months was not met, quite a few of the ideologically inappropriate monuments were indeed demolished. Here you have a statue of one of the Russian Tsars in Moscow, Alexander III, I think it is, demolished in 1918. That is right after Lenin's decree. And here's another example. Another Russian Tsar in the city of Rostov-on-Don. It was not demolished until 1924, but between 1918 and 1924, it was closed from the public eye by a wooden fence. The new monuments on Lenin's list were built hastily and of shoddy materials, and very few of them survived up until this day. After Lenin's death in 1924, he became the main tool of monumental propaganda himself. The first statues began to appear literally overnight after the news of Lenin's death reached the nation. And those early ones were a genuine manifestation of the universal grassroots veneration. They came in different shapes, different designs, and different materials. By the 1930s, Lenin's image became canonized and monopolized by the state. Lenin was endowed with the status of forever alive, a universally worshipped founding father. The Communist pantheon thus acquired its primary hero, ubiquitous, universally recognizable. Lenin's statues adorned the main squares of every Soviet city and town. His portraits were present in every classroom, every auditorium, every office, every institution, etc. Otherwise, the early Soviet pantheon did not change much since Lenin signed his plan of monumental propaganda, especially as far as politics is concerned. Monuments of Stalin began to appear in early 1930s at first as Lenin associated. So this is one of the cannons, and it has two leaders sitting side by side on a bench. They dead but forever alive, and they're still alive but already immortalized. Stalin image quickly became as ubiquitous as Lenin's has been, with his portraits as well as streets, cities, etc. named after him. Other Bolsheviks were commemorated much later. The three most prominent among them are Dzerzhinsky, first statue erected in 1958, Kalinin in 1974, Svetlov in 1978. Throughout the Soviet period, all monuments bore a state of approval of the Communist Party. The party was the guardian of the national pantheon. And all the monuments erected in the Soviet Union were commissioned by the party. The party also decided which sculptors would be entrusted with building the monuments. In mid to late 1940s, monuments commemorating World War II heroes and glorifying the Soviet victory over Nazi Germany began to emerge. The scope of this commemoration grew much larger under Brezhnev, beginning in 1965, the 20th anniversary of victory, and reached gigantic proportions under Putin's rule, and I will get to that later. In 1956, 3 years after Stalin's death, Khrushchev famously condemned Stalin personality cults and mass repressions in his secret speech at the 20th Communist Party Congress. But Stalin's statues mostly remained in place for another 5 years. This comes from a new Yugoslavia ambassador appointed to the Soviet Union who arrived in Moscow in 1956, soon after Khrushchev's secret speech. And he reported seeing enormous portraits of Stalin as though Khrushchev's secret speech has never been pronounced. According to the same visitor, even Khrushchev's own outer office had a Stalin portrait hanging on the wall. Khrushchev's secret speech encouraged spontaneous removals. Here and there, people were tearing down Stalin portraits or defaced them. But the government operation of demolition of Stalin statues did not begin until 1961. And that was the second iconoclasm. That year, Stalin was secretly removed from the mausoleum and reburied behind it. It was done at nighttime, so nobody would be able to watch it. He was buried in a pit covered with several truckloads of cement, and that same year, Stalingrad was renamed Volgograd. A bust on Stalin's grave appeared, but only 10 years later, and remains there till this day. In this photo, you can see Gennady Zyuganov, the leader of the Russian Communist Party today, the opposition party, or nominally opposition party, or tame opposition party, as it is often referred to, in the Russian parliament. Laying flowers to this bust of Stalin, something that he and his allies do regularly, at least once a year. The second Soviet iconoclasm was not only the most radical of the three, and I will talk about the third one later, but arguably it was the most radical in the history of mankind. All the countless Stalin monuments, images, and names were thoroughly erased. The only one that was left in place was a Stalin statue in Georgia, where Stalin was born. After that, and through the end of the Soviet Union, the national pantheon remained mostly unchanged because then we had this stagnation period. The bust of Stalin that you see in this picture is the only image of Stalin that was, in a sense, returned. The only image that appeared was erected after early 60s when Stalin statues were erased. So the Pantheon, as it emerged, it has evolved in the later decades of the Soviet Union, consisted of ubiquitous Lenins, of countless World War II or Great Patriotic War, as it is referred to in Russia and was referred to in the Soviet Union, memorials of fallen soldiers, war heroes, a range of cultural figures, a selection of Bolsheviks, mostly the three that I mentioned, Brzezinski, Kalinin, and Sverdlov. Local heroes were added here and there upon endorsement by the Central Communist Party authorities. And what is generally referred to as creeping re-Stalinization during stagnation period was not accompanied by a return of stone images, again, except for this bust. One major member was added to the Pantheon during that period. This is the most obvious addition. Yuri Gagarin, the monument was built in 1980 in a huge Russian square. But although the Soviet Union thereby got a new universally recognized hero and recognized up until this day, this was not about a revision of state symbols. Two trends of that period are worth mentioning. The ever-growing number of Great Patriotic War memorials. And the second one here is probably the largest, most magnificent of all, probably the best known, the one in Stalingrad, of course, to commemorate the Stalingrad battle. Another trend was monuments of ideologically appropriate international figures, mostly foreign communist leaders or left-leaning political figures. But this trend can be seen as a token of expansion of the Soviet imperial sway or soft power, depending on how you want to look at it. But of course, none of those figures that included figures from non-aligned countries and, as I said already, communist leaders, none could claim the status of a universally commemorated national hero. So now we have got to the end of the Soviet Union and the third spell of iconoclasm, which begins, of course, with overthrowing the statue to Felix Dzerzhinsky, a world-famous image that was on the front pages of basically every newspaper in the world in August 1991. Here is another image from the same scene. The euphoric crowd just trampled the symbol of KGB, the oppressive force of the Soviet Union, of course, erected, you can see it from this one, right in front of the KGB building. So the third iconoclasm, however, proved to be much more modest than the second. A few cities and streets were named, but most Lenins remained in place. So here is what is believed to be the largest and also the latest major Lenin statue, erected in 1985 and opened by Mikhail Gorbachev. It is in a square that is now called Kaluzhskaya Zastava, the beginning of Lenin Avenue or Leninski Prospect, and according to some estimates, though, well, this is really hard to estimate, in 1991 there were 7,000 Lenins in Russia. And by the end of 2018, when this estimate was made, 6,000 remained in place. For comparison, in Ukraine, in 1991, 5,500 Lenins used to stand, and only 350 remained late last year. Those communist statues that were torn down were at first irreverently dumped in a park around an art gallery in Moscow that was later renamed the Garden of Sculptures. that in 1998, a Russian sculptor made a composition called Victims of Totalitarian Regime that was placed right next to the displaced and defaced monuments to that regime's leaders. It is really a powerful image. It shows 283 human heads carved of stone and piled behind bars in a massive concrete wall. Here's a closer look. This marked the end of the long decades of the party-state monopoly over symbolic politics. In particular, its role as the guardian of the national pantheon. Amidst the political turmoil and bloody clashes and economic miseries of the 1990s, Yeltsin's government did not have the time or energy for symbolic politics or nation building. 1990s became the time of the rectification of historical injustice conducted mostly by private or local actors. And historical injustice as far as commemoration in stone is concerned. Monuments to various figures and events deemed inappropriate or unworthy of commemoration under the communist regime began to appear in Moscow and elsewhere. Some of those commemorative steps were still initiated by the state, but the majority were local or private. But here's an example of a state-initiated one. A mounted monument to Georgy Zhukov was erected at the entrance to the Red Square. Now, Zhukov's statue was not an introduction of a new hero. It was a recognition of his broadest national fame as a highly decorated grand commander of the Great Patriotic War, and in many ways the mastermind of the Soviet victory over Nazi Germany. After the war, Zhukov's glory and universal popularity made both Stalin and then Khrushchev apprehensive of the man, and Zhukov was at various times disfavored by both Soviet leaders. Most other new monuments, as I mentioned, were built on private or local initiatives, and here is the example. Monument to Vladimir Vysotsky, a bard who enjoyed also broadest popular admiration, even worship in the Soviet Union. It was never fully, that is, officially established as a figure of national fame. So again, an example of a rectification of injustice, not a new hero associated with post-communist Russia. The first monument to Vysotsky was followed by many more, and at least 25 to 30 Vysotsky statues are found around Russia today. Both Vysotsky and Zhukov have been repeatedly named in various public opinion polls among the top 10 greatest Russians. Throughout the 90s, regions and cities were rediscovering or reinventing their local histories and building their own new identities and monuments. Most commonly, they commemorated ancient princes or saints. Nearly every historic Russian city of the European part of Russia, Ryazan, Tver, Vladimir, Yaroslavl, Pskov, Kolomna, quite a few others, erected one or a few of those. Monuments to saints and princes of nationwide scope also appear here and there, and of those, the most common are Cyril and Methodius, Byzantine missionaries who designed the first alphabet used to transcribe Old Church Slavonic. Around the same time, mid-1990s, Moscow mayor commissioned a gigantic statue of Peter the Great. Unlike a variety of local saints and princes, Peter the Great looked like an appropriate symbol for the newly established Russian state, a progressive, reformist, modernizing, if brutal, Western-oriented leader. Besides, he was arguably the most famous Russian Tsar because of his place in the Soviet popular historical narrative as well as literature and film. But Peter the Great, the commemoration of Peter the Great in this way was initiated and commissioned by the Moscow mayor Yuri Lushkov. Meanwhile, President Yeltsin and Mayor Lushkov were not on good terms, and Yeltsin could not possibly endorse the national symbol initiated by the Moscow mayor. Besides, the statue became an object of vicious criticism. It was deemed ugly, interfering with the Moscow landscape. Well, not sure about what you think, but I generally agree. Another attempt to come up with an appropriate symbol for a new Russia was undertaken by the Union of Right-Wing Forces, Russia's Liberal Party. That was a monument to Alexander II, the Tsar who was the liberator of peasants from serfdom. However, by the time the monument was erected, the Union of Right-Wing Forces had lost its popularity, its representation in the Duma, and its political weight. So Alexander II also did not become any more recognizable or recognized than he was before, and certainly not a member of the new pantheon. The symbol of the 1945 victory, meanwhile, was steadily becoming grander and grander. A gigantic memorial was built in Moscow by the Moscow mayor Yushkov in Poklonnaya Gora. The design had existed at least since 1950s, but was only accomplished in 1990s. And more statues have been added to this complex on a yearly basis. But let me cite a few more instances of privately initiated and privately sponsored rectification of the Soviet time injustice. Monuments to soldiers killed in Afghanistan, privately sponsored, began to emerge all over Russia. About 700 memorials to victims of mass repressions of various scope and size have also been erected in a range of localities. The largest and more impressive among them was erected in Magadan, called the Mask of Sorrow, made by a famous Soviet and Russian sculptor, Neizvestny. His idea was to build 3 of these in what he called as the 3 capitals of the Gulag, namely Magadan, Yekaterinburg, and Vorkuta. The one in Yekaterinburg was actually built last year, but Vorkuta still doesn't have one. Quite a number of artistic and literary figures who were unwelcome and or fallen victims of Stalin's repressions were also commemorated on private and privately sponsored initiatives. Among them, Akhmatova, Tsvetaeva, Mandelstam. In fact, there are several monuments to Mandelstam around Russia. And since the state no longer played the role of ultimate authority in the politics of symbols, here and there, countless statues were built just for fun. The freedom of expression gave rise to a broad variety of light-hearted, ironic statues that would have been inconceivable in the Soviet Union. Come to think of it, also a rectification of injustice of sorts. To give you an idea, the category of sculptured images of ironic kind, among a great deal of others, includes a statue of a mosquito, of a can of Sprats, a hammer, a stool, a chair, a plumber, an electrician, an elephant, a drunkard, a laboratory rodent, a businesswoman, an apple, a cucumber, chocolate and processed cheese, a kitten, and a range of literary and film characters. Well, I will only show you one. This is called Plumber, more like a sewer man, some such, but this is in the city of Ussurisk in the Far East. Observing the Russian monument scene in 2010, Alexei Makarkin, a prominent Russian political analyst, wrote that the dominance of the states as a defining and centralizing power in questions of monumental propaganda, and he puts it in quotation marks, became a thing of the past. So that was 2010. The past, however, returned much sooner than anyone could expect. In the year 2012 became a watershed in many ways, following mass anti-Putin protests in 2011 and 2012. The Kremlin, and Putin in particular, intensified their operation in ideological and symbolic realm. One of those moves was the establishment in 2012 of the Russian Military Historical Society. Very soon, the Military Historical Society launched what it unabashedly referred to as the Program of Monumental Propaganda. This is its formal name. And over 200 statues have been erected under the auspices of the Military Historical Society in a matter of just about 6 years since its foundation. Many, though not all, are war memorials and victory statues, but again, not all. Formally, the Russian Military Historical Society is not a government organization, but its board includes top-ranking officials and some of the wealthiest tycoons. And as is commonly the case in Russia, everyone understands that the Russian Military Historical Society is entrusted with an important government mission, and this means that it is assured of generous government grants and lavish donations. So after 3 spells of iconoclasm and 1 episode of monumental fever, Russia had a relapse of monumental fever, roughly 100 years since Lenin's plan of monumental propaganda. By this I mean that the Russian state, the Russian government, has focused on the symbolic sphere and on erecting monuments after paying little attention to this realm in previous years. And in the course of his 3rd term, Putin has repeatedly attended inaugurations of monuments that may claim the role of new Russian national symbols. Now, in the remaining part of my talk, I will look at what do these new monuments symbolize? Who are Russia's new heroes promoted by the state? And what is the impact of this new flush of monument fever on the pantheon existing in the minds and hearts of today's Russians? Several symbolically charged monuments have been erected in Moscow in the past few years. The earliest, and this is the end of 2012, is Pyotr Stolypin, the Russian prime minister in the early 20th century, erected right outside the Russian Duma. Stolypin can be described as a conservative reformist, an image that appeared to have an appeal for Putin. Putin quoted Stolypin several times and attended the opening of this monument. But unlike the Soviet monumental propaganda, the erection of Stolypin was not followed by a dissemination of Stolypin-related narrative that would promote Stolypin's figure and generate broad recognition. Besides, since 2012, when the monument was erected, reformist language has mostly disappeared from the political rhetoric. The same happened with other seemingly significant new monuments. Putin attends the opening, gives a speech, end of story. The monument is there with no narrative attached. One of those is Alexander I, who, along with other European monarchs, took part in what we call today the building of a new international order after the end of Napoleonic Wars. Not a bad symbol for Russia as a major global power. But of course, Russia's relations with the West have since given way to confrontation instead of cooperation. So another monument and another speech by Putin. This is Alexander III, a very conservative Russian Tsar, notorious for having explicitly denied access to education to common men. And though, of course, this was not what Putin spoke about at the inauguration, no follow-up narrative in this case either. Here's one more, also symbolically charged. St. Vladimir, the 10th century prince who Christianized ancient Rus in Kiev. This monument, as you can see, is erected right next to the Kremlin. And this particular monument may have a better chance of gaining prominence because of its location, and is a symbol of Russia as a realm of genuine Christianity as opposed to the ungodly West. Putin spoke along these lines early in his 3rd term in 2013 and 2014, not much since though. In fact, the implications of having St. Vladimir statue in the Russian capital are political rather than religious or ecclesiastical. Given the current hostility between Russia and Ukraine, Kiev has become inappropriate as a site of the Christianization of Rus. And while it is impossible to relocate Christianization to Moscow, Moscow did not even exist at the time of Christianization, and of course St. Vladimir never set foot there because it didn't exist. The Kremlin has relocated St. Vladimir himself and thus sort of appropriated him. The government's monument fever has inspired other actors who have an ambition of inculcating their own symbolic messages in the Russian public. While Putin's czars, Alexander I, Alexander III, or Lipman, not a czar but an imperial statesman, have not become any more recognized. Nicholas II, on the other hand, executed by the Bolsheviks and canonized by the Russian Orthodox Church in 2000 as a saint passion bearer, is more popular than either of the Alexanders commemorated on Putin's initiative. Monuments to the last Russian Tsar, Nicholas II, are not too many, but new ones are appearing. And even though Putin is unlikely to admire a ruler who ended in a tragic failure, having lost his family, his country, and his life to his political adversaries, Putin almost said so on one occasion. I would like to emphasize this. Despite Putin's uncontested stature, way above anybody else among the Russian political elites, and although in recent years he has made significant contributions to symbolic policy, he is not perceived as an ideological or moral authority, nor does he seem to claim one. Today, each has his and her own Tsar to adore, or a non-royal figure for that matter. For instance, this is Ivan the Terrible. The monument was erected in the city of Oriol. The monument to a Tsar notorious for his ferocious ways was not initiated by the Kremlin, and even caused protests in the city of Oriol. But the Kremlin didn't get in the way. Here's one more example. This is Kalashnikov, the designer of the assault rifle named after him. Was erected in downtown Moscow quite recently. May not seem like a good symbol given that Kalashnikov rifle is used to kill people all over the world, but here he is to stay. Also, I think an exceptional ugly one. About 40 or 50 Stalin busts have appeared in various Russian localities during Putin's tenure, some 15 in his third term. The government has not initiated those statues, but neither has it gotten in the way. All of the busts are small-scale, private initiatives, not centrally located. And since the society is split over Stalin, sometimes Stalin busts get vandalized, like this one in Lipman. For his part, Putin avoids mentioning Stalin, and in late 2017, he inaugurated a memorial of victims of political repressions called the Wall of Sorrow. This is something that Nikita Khrushchev was talking about, but never implemented. Also Gorbachev also never implemented. And counterintuitively, it fell upon Putin to initiate and then inaugurate this first ever national memorial to the victims of mass repressions. Late last year, Putin also opened in Moscow a statue of Alexander Solzhenitsyn. This move is hardly likely to make Solzhenitsyn any more popular. A majority hold a positive opinion of Solzhenitsyn, but for instance, communists in Rostov-on-Don effectively opposed the idea of erecting the Solzhenitsyn statue in their city, where he spent a long time during his young years. In Vladivostok, Solzhenitsyn statue was defaced. So while the Kremlin and the Russian Orthodox Church and part of the Russian public may be mourning the victims of Stalin's repressions, the Russian Orthodox Church has canonized some of them as saint martyrs. Some others are glorifying the executioners, such as Stalin or Dzerzhinsky. A bust was erected, a bust to Kirov was Dzerzhinsky was erected in Kiev in 2017. Of course, Saint Dzerzhinsky, which you saw dangling when he was torn down by the euphoric crowds in Moscow in August 1991. Of course, the founder of the Soviet security police. And of course, FSB, the successor of KGB, prides itself on being a successor to the earlier Soviet security police that executed mass repressions. To make the picture even more complicated, Putin joins them on their annual celebrations. There's nothing extraordinary in the compatibility of sculpted symbols in public spaces. Regimes change as a result of revolutions or liberations, and old monuments commonly remain in place. What is peculiar about Russia today is the simultaneous appearance of many new statues and monuments with incompatible symbolic meanings. Putin, of course, is not unaware of the existing ideological differences regarding the perception of the past. Ever since 2000, when he first became president, he repeatedly mentioned it in his public speeches and emphasized the need for accord and reconciliation. Yet he does not want to seek to reconcile by inculcating a unifying and shared perception of the past. Instead, the Kremlin pursues this all-embracing or omnivorous approach. One, in today's Russia, can be a communist, a monarchist, a religious fundamentalist, or a Stalinist, and venerate his and her respective symbols. As long as these ideological activists don't stir unwanted passions among the broad public, and the majority remains largely ideologically indifferent and politically acquiescent. This is not a project of reconciliation for the sake of unity, rather a project of pacification for the sake of acquiescence and stability. The all-embracing approach is illustrated by a new monumental project in downtown Moscow, which is called an Alley of Rulers, and shows identical busts of every Russian ruler, beginning from ancient princes to Lenin, and of course Tsars and Lenin and Stalin, and even our loved Gorbachev and Yeltsin. The monument fever is driven not just by the ideologically concerned political public actors. The Kremlin and Putin's temporary focus on ideological and symbolic politics has generated supply. The over 200 monuments produced by the Russian Military Historical Society mean lucrative contracts. There are few champions, sculptors who boast to have produced already dozens of statues in the matter of just a few years. But while the flush of monumental fever has opened good opportunities for sculptors, what about its impact on the Russian national pantheon of heroes, the one that exists in people's minds and hearts? The Russian Military Historical Society website opens with a following quote from Putin. Our country needs heroes, and everyone should know who they are. They should serve as role models for the young people growing up today, for their children. And although Putin added this is very important, the new Russian monument policy reflects the Kremlin's lack of definitive guidelines regarding appropriate post-Soviet heroes. Lenin monuments still remain by far the most numerous and recognizable, but Lenin almost never occurs in the government rhetoric. Putin referred to him on several occasions, but only to criticize his farce. Another nationally recognizable figure is, of course, Pushkin, and nobody questions him. But there is nothing new about Pushkin. So what about the new ones inaugurated in Putin's tenure? The recent official commemorations in stones of czars, saints, and princes that I've referred to as monument fever, the Alexanders, Lipman, Prince Vladimir, Solzhenitsyn, Nicholas II, canonized by the Church, have not pushed them to the top of the Russian pantheon. In fact, judging by the public opinion polls, this pantheon has not changed much since the Soviet days. And of the top 10 most significant Russians, most belong in the Soviet pantheon. So this slide shows several public opinion polls taken in 2003, 2008, and 2017. And as you see, most or all, nearly all, these figures belong in the Soviet pantheon. I've emphasized that the two czars included in that people name as the most significant Russians, Peter the Great and Catherine II, were prominent members of the Soviet historical pantheon, official Soviet historical pantheon, that, unlike today's, was quite definitive. Both czars were referred as great in the Soviet school curriculum and public historical narratives, but none has been especially glorified in recent years, and here they are in this list. The high appreciation of Stalin, and actually he emerges as number one in 2017, is a complicated issue, but certainly not the result of explicit official glorification. And the only true new name on the list is Vladimir Putin. Thank you.
Okay, I think we have time for some questions.
Thank you. This is quite a story of men, and I noticed Catherine II. Are there statues of women? There's probably good reason why the males dominate. Are women advising Putin? What's the future hold for women?
Thank you. As I mentioned, in Lenin's plan of monumental propaganda, there were two women. One mathematician, Sofia Petrovskaya, and the other actress, Rajevskaya. Still, there were two. New women to be commemorated lately. Well, there are peculiar ones. Of course, there are local commemorations that I haven't spoken about. The city of Yoshkar-Ola, the capital of Mariel, a small and not very wealthy republic on the Volga, has a sculptured image of Elizaveta Petrovna, the Russian Tsarina, not the most popular one. But this is a curious example. Well, there are women, of course, but I cannot recall any new women. Again, as I mentioned, there are few instances of figures that are associated with today. Well, of course, there's a statue of Nadezhda Krupskaya, Lenin's wife and widow, in Moscow. Not those who are, well, businesswoman is one of those lighthearted, and it is not the mockery. She is like a businesswoman dressed appropriately. As to women advising Putin, I would say yes, there are, and we have quite prominent women in quite prominent government positions, including the Russian equivalent of the Federal Reserve. The central bank chairperson is a woman. Several government ministers are women. If we go a little down below, and the lady who is the central bank chairperson is said to have Putin's ear, to be somebody who he trusts on very important financial issues. Ministers in his cabinet, well, of course, it's inconceivable in Russia what we see in some European countries, women in the position of a minister of defense, or of course, the KGB, FSB, or the police. This is absolutely inconceivable, and there are no women there except in inferior position. Well, not exactly inferior, but not first or second rank. For some reason, in the Ministry of Defense, there are quite a lot of women dealing with the finance of the Ministry of Defense. Well, it would have been better if the Kremlin acknowledged the contribution of Tomsk, but it is better than just the militarization that had been the trend before that, and especially at the height of the confrontation with the West. A new slogan commemorating the victory appeared in the streets of Russian cities, which was, "We can repeat it," meaning we can go to Europe and conquer whatever it is. The Russian for that is "Можем повторить." So that was one trend, and another trend, which is more human, And Putin himself, and it is a well-known fact that his father fought in Great War. He joined the Immortal Regiment March, I think 2 or 3 years ago, carrying the portrait of his father, which added attraction to the event, but the event itself has been very, very large scale in Russia. So in a sense, I'm not sure where I am in between these two points of view, but I think it's still a good thing that people are celebrating by thinking about those who fought than about Russian military might and the fact that we are well armed and well equipped to go and conquer European countries.
Thank you very much.
Well, it would have been better if the Kremlin acknowledged the contribution of Tomsk, but it is better than just the militarization that had been the trend before that. And especially at the height of the confrontation with the West, a new slogan commemorating the victory appeared in the streets of Russian cities, which was, "We can repeat it," meaning we can go to Europe and conquer whatever it is. The Russian for that is "Можем повторить." So that was one trend. And another trend, which is more human. And Putin himself, and it is a well-known fact that his father fought in Great War. He joined the Immortal Regiment March, I think 2 or 3 years ago, carrying the portrait of his father, which added attraction to the event, but the event itself has been very, very large scale in Russia. So in a sense, I'm not sure where I am in between these two points of view, but I think it's still a good thing that people are celebrating by thinking about those who fought than about Russian military might and the fact that we are well armed and well equipped to go and conquer European countries.
Thank you very much.